Hi everyone, my name is Hamid Ahari, Category Manager at OECM. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all those attending today's webinar. We are joined today by CDW Canada's Risk Advisory Services team, who will be presenting the power of prevention, how proactive penetration testing and vulnerability assessments can strengthen your cybersecurity posture. CDW Canada is a platinum supplier partner with OECM and currently holds 4 of our agreements. Today's session is geared specifically towards the IT Vulnerability Assessment and Penetration Testing Services Agreement, which is available to all OECM members, in order to strengthen your cybersecurity posture. And with that, I'll pass it over to CDW Cybersecurity Advisor, Dave Way, to kick off the session. Enjoy.
Yes, thanks so much, Hamid, and hello to all of our attendees. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure for me to be able to spend the next 30 minutes or so with you, a little bit less now, to discuss a very relevant and important topic to all of us. I'm actually going to turn off my camera now, not because I want to be antisocial, but rather because I've had bandwidth issues with my connection this morning, and I don't want to push my luck. So with that said, we will continue on with our presentation. By way of agenda, thanks, Ms. Ree. By way of agenda, we'll start off by describing the cybersecurity threat landscape in 2022. In particular, we're going to touch on the developments over the past 2 years or so and the impact that the COVID pandemic has had in ratcheting up cyber risks for Canadian public sector organizations in particular. And we'll identify the most common types of security breaches currently being experienced by the broader public sector organizations in Canada. We're then going to explain why penetration testing is such a vital activity in minimizing the risks and preventing at least limiting the negative impact of cyber attacks. We'll identify where to get started with penetration testing and, importantly, how to get the best value in strengthening your cybersecurity posture. Next, we're going to do a quick overview of CDW Risk Advisory Services, of which I am part. We're going to describe the security testing services that we can provide under the OECM agreement, and specifically how we can help you out in your cybersecurity journey, which is often how we refer to it. And then finally, we're going to discuss the OECM VAPT agreement, and we'll define that in a few moments. Specifically, we're going to review the scope of the OECM testing services and how your organization can take advantages of the benefits of the VAPT agreement. Okay, so the cybersecurity threat landscape in 2022. Okay, so each year, for those not familiar, CDW publishes a cybersecurity study. The research is conducted independently by a company called IDC Canada. This year's study was published in May and includes survey participants from over 500 organizations in Canada. Our annual cybersecurity study is especially significant because, as far as we know, it's the only Canadian-focused cybersecurity study of its kind, so it should be relevant to all of us here this morning. In 2022, CDW Canada also commissioned, for the first time, a survey with Angus Reid to examine the sentiment of Canadian IT professionals regarding the cybersecurity posture of their organizations, particularly as it relates to the practice of conducting vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. So very relevant to our subject today, was that study in particular. Okay, so what about some key findings from the last 2 years in Canada? The following are some of the key findings that came out of the recent cybersecurity studies that I referenced, particularly as it relates to the subject of today's webinar, the power of prevention, how proactive penetration testing and vulnerability assessments can strengthen your cybersecurity posture. So what we found is that 95% of Canadian organizations say they take security and protection against threats seriously, yet interestingly, only 60% of the organizations surveyed say that they regularly conduct penetration testing. So it's one thing to say that security is taken seriously, another thing to actually do the testing that's required to improve posture and defend against cyber attacks. Study results consistently show that cyber attacks, and this should not be a surprise to us, are increasing both by way of sophistication and frequency. And yet, while many organizations understand the importance of conducting regular security assessments, nearly 3/4 or 72% of organizations reported concerns over lack of time, resources, and expertise to actually conduct vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. 26% of Canadian organizations experienced a security breach over the past 2 years, resulting in significant business losses, including loss of productivity, loss of data, and financial loss. And I would add to that reputational loss as well. So what are the most common types of security breaches that Canadian organizations experienced over the past 2 years? Two really jump out, and the first one is phishing email / business email compromise attacks. And that's 88% of survey respondents said that they were affected by phishing email, business email compromise attacks. And 72% said that they were the victim of attempts at ransomware / malware cyber attacks. And it's interesting from a public sector perspective, the education sector had a particularly difficult time, we found, maintaining its security posture over the past 2 years. And the education sector actually lagged behind in some categories, particularly as it relates to penetration testing. The education sector also had the highest level of concern over their organization's penetration testing capabilities as compared to other industry sectors. The government sector were more than twice as likely to experience a security breach over the past 2 years as compared to those in the organizations in the very highly targeted financial sector. So that's fairly significant. More than half, 57% of Canadian organizations reported that they do not perform regular scanning to even identify vulnerabilities, let alone do anything to remediate them. As it relates to the public sector, while reporting slightly better results than the average across all organizations, there are still significant concerns. Government respondents said that 54% of their organizations do not scan for vulnerabilities. Healthcare said 51% of organizations do not scan for vulnerabilities. And education respondents said that just under 52% of their organizations do not scan regularly for vulnerabilities. 99.3% of 2021 survey respondents reported experiencing cyber attacks over the past 12 months. So virtually everyone, as we know, is experiencing the attacks. Canadian organizations actually reported an average of 1.15 cyber attacks per day. Public sector results were also alarming. Government organizations reported an average of 1.26 cyber attacks per day, and healthcare organizations reported an average of 1.87 cyber attacks per day. 73% of Canadian organizations experienced malware / ransomware attacks with financial demands. Again, the public sector reported significant concerns. Government organizations said that 75% of them report being the victim of ransomware attacks. Healthcare organizations, 70%. And education respondents said that 65% were victim of ransomware attacks or attempts thereby. Significantly, of Canadian organizations that fell victim, this is an interesting fact, of Canadian organizations that fell victim to ransomware attacks, a vast majority, so 76% of those that fell victim to ransomware attacks were subjected to subsequent ransomware attacks after recovering. So it continues on. Once they're attacked once, particularly if they're breached, they're more likely to be the victim of attempts at further ransomware attacks. Only 36% of Canadian organizations were able to fully restore their data and systems from backups after ransomware attacks against them. Suffice to say, the numbers do not paint a pretty picture. Not too many warm and fuzzy stories there to help us sleep better at night. That said, okay, what are some of the public sector security considerations? What about the developments over the past 2 years or so as we've all struggled through the COVID pandemic? Well, we've seen increased cybersecurity challenges for the public sector for sure, and really for all sectors. But within the public sector, we've seen increased adoption of cloud computing strategies. So that's one of the developments, which has definitely enlarged the network perimeter or border that needs to be protected. So for example, in the education sector, we've had the implementation of cloud-based learning management systems, LMS, and student information systems, SIS, using cloud technology. Secondly, we've witnessed a huge transformation, the increased prevalence of course, remote work, or AKA WFH, or work from home, sometimes called hybrid models as well, for staff across all organizations and students alike. So this work from home, remote work, has further expanded the cyber attack surface, or what's sometimes called the threat surface, from primarily previously on-premise network assets to the addition of cloud applications, cloud computing assets, and now we can add to that home Wi-Fi networks, where I'm joining you from today, and laptops/workstations that the remote workers are using. So we've got a greater breadth of threat surface. Government organizations were more likely than other sectors to report that the shift to remote work models heightened or increased their security risk. 59% said that was the case. The education sector has seen the proliferation of e-learning models, which we just referenced a couple minutes ago. Nearly half of education organizations reported that their security posture has been negatively impacted over the past 2 years. And that's actually the highest of all industries. It comes as no surprise that as a result of these developments, malicious actors have been taking advantage of the additional opportunities now open to them, resulting in an across-the-board rise in security breaches. Another development, of course, is that public sector IT teams with limited resources are being stretched as they're required to wear many hats, from network and application support to asset management to help desk, incident response, disaster recovery, and more. But you know all about that. And as if that isn't enough, the IT team, more often than not, gets handed the bonus of primary responsibility for information security. But I feel as though I'm preaching to the choir on this one. And yet 72% of organizations report lack of time, resources, and expertise to actually conduct regular penetration testing. And while this may be an alarming number, when we drill down to the education sector, for example, the figure is even higher, 86% of organizations. Finally, over the past couple of years, and this is a notable one, we've noticed, and we're hearing more often from customers about this one, there's increased mandatory penetration testing as part of industry or regulatory requirements, compliance requirements, both from internal and external stakeholders, and we're certainly hearing a lot more about cyber insurance requirements for pen testing, and those might be all items which you're familiar with. Okay, power of proactive penetration testing. Why penetration test? Why is regular security testing so vital? As cyber attacks continue to increase and become more sophisticated, regular penetration testing allows organizations to identify technical weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and risks before the bad guys find them and exploit them for profit. We at CDW strongly recommend that all organizations should conduct penetration testing annually at least to keep up with the cyber threat actors and to keep up with changes to your environments, of course. And as the threat landscape or cyber attack surface, which we've already referred to, continues to grow exponentially as we've described, and as cyber attacks become increasingly sophisticated, regular penetration testing is more essential than ever in helping minimize the risks and preventing, or at least limiting, the negative impact of cyber attacks. Ransomware is keeping senior executives and IT professionals up at night, right? So given the serious financial, operational, and reputational consequences that often result from successful ransomware attacks, it's imperative that all organizations remain vigilant and leverage penetration testing as what we often refer to as the first line of defense. And so with Canadian organizations, as we've seen, widely reporting lack of internal time, resources, and expertise to focus on regular security testing, the step of engaging a trusted third-party IT partner to perform penetration testing is vital so that vulnerabilities can be identified and remediated before they're exploited by malicious threat actors. Okay. Penetration testing falls under what we call offensive security. It's essentially a proactive or adversarial approach, or mimics an adversarial approach, to prepare and protect network infrastructure, applications, computer systems, and even individuals from cyber attacks and data breaches. Pen testing consultants are well versed in the tactics, techniques, and procedures, or what's known as sometimes as TTPs, that are used by malicious threat actors. Pen testers live, eat, and breathe simulating attack approaches, methods of cyber criminals every day during engagements, hence the term ethical hackers. The mission of pen testers is essentially to find and exploit vulnerabilities before the bad guys do, so organizations can minimize cyber risk and prevent and limit the negative impact of the cyber attacks. This slide illustrates the spectrum of penetration testing services that our CDW team conducts on a regular basis. More about that in a minute. Okay. CDW security testing practice leverages the best industry standards and methodologies for conducting vulnerability assessments and penetration testing, such as OWASP, or Open Web Application Security Project Testing Guide, and that's specifically for web application testing, NIST SP 800-115, which is the NIST Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessments. And in particular, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, the PTES, what's known as PTES, or Penetration Testing Execution Standard. PTES is the industry benchmark or go-to methodology, and it contains the 7 phases of a pen test that you can see at the bottom of the slide. Notably, the PTES methodology applies to the whole spectrum of penetration testing types, which you can see on the slide here, which makes it especially valuable. Okay. Okay. So where to start? I guess we can get the next slide there. Oh, sorry. Can we back up? There we go. Sorry. So where to start? With a limited IT budget, what type of penetration testing services provide the best bang for the buck? Remember the 2 most common types of security breaches experienced in the last 2 years? First were phishing emails, and second was ransomware attacks. Well, penetration testing, particularly network penetration testing, which you can see on the left side, number 1, external and internal network, are by far the most common types of security of penetration testing that our team performs, and that's consistent across the board. We have also web application pen testing, number 2 there, and wireless network penetration testing, number 3. And all of these types of penetration testing help address the threats and risks posed by the increasing prevalence of ransomware and malware type cyber attacks. And importantly, the risks posed by the pervasiveness of phishing email. The thing about phishing emails is, while it might not be particularly sophisticated or new because they've been happening for some time, is still the most effective method to breach a target, I should say, and therefore they're used consistently by cyber threat actors. So phishing email attacks can be minimized by the practice of conducting point-in-time social engineering campaigns. Number 4 there, that's maybe something you haven't thought of, but we regularly perform services, including schools and school boards. We've done email phishing campaigns to test the people side of security. So where to get started? I already mentioned that network pen testing is the most common. External network penetration testing on the left-hand side there assesses the external threat attack surface of your public-facing IPs and public-facing web applications that are accessible to any cyber threat actor. External network pen testing basically assesses the cyber risk posed by your public footprint in the cybersecurity landscape. So you can imagine that's a great place to start. We also have there internal network pen testing, which assesses the cybersecurity posture of your internal threat surface. In other words, it determines the vulnerabilities that could be exploited or what damage could be done by an external threat actor who has already breached your perimeter and gained a foothold into your internal network, or a malicious or rogue insider threat actor looking to do harm. We don't like to think of that as being a factor, but it is unfortunately sometimes. Number 2 is focused web application pen testing, which assesses the unique threats and risks posed by malicious threat actors who know how to identify and exploit web app vulnerabilities to get sensitive or valuable data and cause as much damage as they can. And we rely upon the OWASP top 10 methodology when we focus in on web applications. And then number 3, Wi-Fi or wireless network pen testing assesses whether your wireless network could be hacked or breached, and if so, whether the malicious threat actor could pivot from, for example, a guest network to sensitive internal network segments, for example. And then we've already discussed social engineering or email phishing campaigns, which assess the cybersecurity posture of your people. And unfortunately, as much as we may not want to admit it, the human resources, are often the weakest link. And you know what they say, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So email phishing campaign provides you with a point-in-time snapshot of your cybersecurity posture of your people. And all these services are provided and available under the OECM agreement. Okay. So the purpose of this particular slide is just to make an important distinction between a VA or a vulnerability assessment and a penetration test. So the components of a vulnerability assessment you can see on the left-hand side include the first 3 items. Identify vulnerabilities, both a pen test and a VA does that. Delivery of a report of findings, again, both a VA or vulnerability assessment and a penetration test does that. And a validation of vulnerabilities, which involves, particularly for our team, involves manual effort at this stage to remove false positives, for example, and confirm whether the identified vulnerabilities actually pose a legitimate threat in the real world. Now that's where a VA or vulnerability assessment ends, whereas a penetration test, which you can see on the right column, includes the additional phases. The exploitation phase, where the pen tester actually puts the cyber threat actor hat on and attempts to exploit vulnerabilities most likely to be targeted by a malicious threat actor with the aim of breaching the network perimeter and gaining a foothold in the customer's environment. So it actually tries to exploit the vulnerabilities that were identified in the VA portion. So a VA is a portion of a penetration test, but penetration test goes beyond to also include a post-exploitation phase where the tester, having gained a foothold now, attempts to elevate credentials or privileges and move laterally within the environment to determine how much access can be obtained to sensitive assets and data, again, simulating what a real-world threat actor would do. So a vulnerability assessment might be a great place to start if your organization has never, or at least not recently, conducted security testing, and it's more economical, for example, for an internal network with a large volume of assets or IP addresses. However, penetration testing provides much richer and more valuable information for the following reasons. You've got a strong effort on manual testing, and our CDW testers spend about 80% of their effort on manual testing. This process allows our consultants to discover additional vulnerabilities that automated tools would not pick up in a VA. Secondly, penetration testing simulates the type of attacks that would actually be leveraged, or attack paths that would be leveraged by a skilled, motivated threat actor. Consequently, pen testing provides a much better measure of the real-world risk posed by discovered vulnerabilities and basically provides a comprehensive snapshot of an organization's cybersecurity posture. Okay, quickly, a little bit about our cyber security testing team, the Risk Advisory Services team at CDW. Next slide. So just a very quick note here. If you look at the far right of your slide, you'll see that CDW acquired a company called Scalar Decisions in the map in terms of instantly having a world-class IT services practice here in Canada. And just a side note, myself and the majority of our Risk Advisory Services team come from the Scalar Decisions acquisition. The next slide. This next slide gives you a snapshot of our wider IT security arm, and that is our security practice, which is comprised of over 100 security-focused professionals. Next slide. Of the security practice containing over 100 security professionals, over 20 of them make up our Risk Advisory Services team, which include our pen testing consultants, which I've been talking about this morning. And oh, by the way, there's me at the top right, in case you're playing Where's Waldo at the moment. And you've probably noticed from seeing me at the beginning of the slide, the last 2 years of COVID have taken its toll. Okay, next slide. Our CDW RAS team, which I mentioned earlier, Risk Advisory Services team, has been conducting penetration tests and vulnerability assessments for over 12 years now. We invest in people, and they've obtained the key offensive security certifications that you would want for penetration testing consultants that you need to place your trust in when they're testing your networks and infrastructure. Our testing consultants are all based in Canada, so you don't have to worry about your security testing being outsourced, for example, to overseas operations somewhere. The next slide talks about the fact that people are a strength and just gives you a more rounded or fuller, extensive list of the security certifications that our security practice has invested in and holds. Next slide. Okay. So what are the next steps? Well, through CDW Canada, OECM members can procure cybersecurity assessments and testing services, such as those that have been described this morning, under the OECM IT VAPT agreement. And for those wondering, VAPT or VAPT stands for Vulnerability Assessment and Penetration Testing. Next slide. Oh, you're already there, sorry. The scope of the OECM contract is shown here, vulnerability assessments, which I described on the far left of that chart. Category B in the middle shows the penetration testing services. And I just want to make a quick mention that Category C references a number of more holistic types of security assessments and testing that can be provided under the OECM agreement, which are not just limited to penetration testing, but much more than that. For example, risk assessments, privacy impact assessments, and so on. In order to leverage the OECM agreement, organizations must sign the OECM VAPT CSA, or Customer Supplier Agreement. And by the way, the Customer Supplier Agreement and the rate card and more details on OECM agreement can be requested either through your CDW account manager or through the OECM website. And if you'd like to book a session with our RAS team, please reach out to your CDW account manager today. We've actually recently received word, and the news was good, that we'll be working with one of the large school boards within the GTA to provide some of the services that we've been talking about this morning. So we're very pleased about that. And then finally, don't have much time, my apologies. Time went quickly on us. I don't know if we have a couple minutes for questions, but certainly for those of you who were not able to get your questions answered as I went through the presentation, we'll take note of those and we'll contact you to ensure that we cover them off. So thanks very much for your time this morning, and I'm not sure if we have any time for questions because we're just past noon.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. We did get a question. We did get a question in. We have it answered. If you do have questions about who your CDW account team is, please reach out to oecm@cdw.ca and we can get started on that for you and help you out. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.